First thing is, go to the GIK Acoustics website, use our advice form, and get your details over to us so we can see what you got going on. That way we can help you, right? And you know, GIK, we've got a lot of products, and if you don't know what you're doing, it can be option overload. For me, I've got so many ways to solve problems. It's exciting, you know, and having a good understanding of all these tools that I have at my disposal to fix your room that's the essence of what GIK is about right there. So we're going to talk about what are the problems of sound in a room that we're solving, right? So that we can work and get work done and feel confident about our work and your students, right? Things like learning how to mix is really hard. There's a lot going on there, right? You have to not only learn the techniques and what's the attack and the release do on the compressor, but you also have to learn what all that sounds like, right? You know, because you can have the abstractions of the techniques, but until you really become conversant with the sounds that are being produced, that's the whole point. And if you're working and mixing in an untreated room, that room is going to get in the way of your work because you can't hear what you're doing very well. I use the analogy, it's like a painter trying to do a painting, but they've got like psychedelic sunglasses on, right? And you're like, you can't quite see the colors. That's a similar analogy when we're working in an untreated room because of how the room is affecting what you're hearing. Do you guys know what a frequency response graph is? You guys conversant with that? Frequency on the x-axis, level on the y-axis, right? I get a lot of those. People send me those. Here's what my room is. And I'm like, well, okay, that's cool. That's useful, right? That gives us a little bit of information about your room because you can generate those pretty easily. There's a lot of software packages you can use to get a response reading. The analogy that I like to use is that's like hiking with a compass, right? It gives you some useful information. It can get you where you need to go. We're gonna look at spectrograms. You guys familiar with those before? Have you seen them? These give you a lot more information because a lot of what happens in a room doesn't show up in the frequency response graph. And there's other problems that we have to solve. And we have to understand what the problem is before we can solve it. So here we go. Here's a spectrogram. And this is literally a client sent me this a while ago. And it was a classic case of a home studio. If I remember right, it was about a 10 by 14 room, like a bedroom, right? So let's look at this, okay? So the spectrogram's a little different from, the frequency response graph. We still have frequency on the x-axis left to right, but level, instead of on the y-axis, level's depicted in color, okay? I think of this, and this, John gave me this one, I think of this as the view from 30,000 feet, right, of what your room is doing. So the reds down there in the low end, those are the loudest points, so the level's in color. Whereas the deep blues, that's just barely above the noise floor. The y-axis now, instead of level, is decay time, okay? How long does it take that frequency to decay in the room? And that's a very, very, very big part of the challenges we have to overcome. Let's look at this here for a second, okay? We can see, you know, the bass response, we can see the mid-range, we can see the treble. What do you guys notice about this? Like translate that if you can. Like, what do you think this room is going to sound like? Very mid-rangey. How come? Look at these decay times. This is 1.5K down to 300 hertz. That's exactly the mid-range, right? This line going across here is about 650 milliseconds. Think of like a reverb decay time. That's, you know, noticeable for sure, you know. So yeah, for sure, the mid-range is going to linger in the room longer. That's going to be the reverb. And like if you put a reverb plugin on someone or on a track or something, and you adjust the decay time, it's the same decay time for all the frequencies. I mean, there's probably specialty plugins now where that's not the case, but in general, that's the case. So one of the challenges is the decay times are different at different frequencies. What causes all this? Why is this happening in the room? And the short answer, it's reflections. Reflected sound energy is creating all this stuff. The way that sound behaves in the room, sound requires time. Sound does not exist without time. It's vibration. If there's no time, it's not moving, right? So the time is built into it. And then also you get reflected sound waves that are moving around the room interfering with other sound waves, okay? And it's just like phase relationships, right? When you're using two microphones on the same source. In some frequencies, they cancel out. Like here, for instance, there's not much energy there. Here, right? But in other frequencies, it gets really loud because the phase relationships are such that they build up and you get those loud peaks. But all of it has the same cause. It's reflected sound waves interfering with each other. Looking more at this, it's very mid-rangey. Anybody notice anything else about the graph? I'll tell you what I see. And there's a concept here that I'm introducing. It's called the Schroeder frequency, and every room has one. Above the Schroeder frequency, sound behaves a little differently than below the frequency. And we can see that in the graph. Above that point, look how closely spaced all those spikes are in time. It's a very more even wash. Below there, it's more spread out. There's more resonances. That's what the bass is doing, okay? So instead of a reverb, like you would get in the mids and the highs, you get specific tuned resonances that are related to the room's dimensions and several other things. Where the speakers are in the room will affect that. It requires a couple of different approaches to fix it. And again, all these problems we're talking about have the same effect, or the same cause, sorry, and that is reflected sound. So what we can do is put treatments in the room, right, that are going to absorb or diffuse those reflections and keep them from doing this. Sound also has size, right, especially the bass. Those are really long wavelengths, right, as far as how they move through the room. And like this one here, this is the biggest one, both of these really. So that's 90 hertz, that's about 140 hertz. And even below there, the big one all the way on the left side, that's what, 48 hertz. So I looked this up so I know. That's sort of right between F sharp and G. So what happens if you're trying to mix a song in the key of G, where the kick drum is tuned to the G, right? You're trying to mix that, but all you hear is, whoa, 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 you know? And then, again, related to the time thing, do you guys see this little black line, squiggly graph there? That is the peak energy curve. In other words, when is the sound at that frequency loudest after it's excited? Here at 90, that's about 100 milliseconds. That means when that kick drum hits, 100 milliseconds later, it's loudest. You hear that resonance. So it's like, you know what I mean? So when we treat the room, look what happened. It looks a lot different, right? Okay, so this is a very simple baseline treatment strategy with GIK. The big question I ask people is, how much space can we use in the room to fix it? You guys go into Studio C, the control room, and you know the treatments are what, 4 feet thick, 3 feet thick? High-end rooms use a lot of space to fix this stuff. And we don't always have that luxury, you know, especially in home studios. If you got a 10 by 14 room and you're using 4 feet in all 4 walls, you don't have any space left, right? So we have to maximize what we're gonna do. So this result here comes from this is the very first GIK product, the 244. Still absolutely one of my favorites. It's very versatile, very cost effective, and you can get a lot of them on a low budget. One of the most important parts of the results we're gonna get with acoustics is about coverage area. In other words, how many square feet of treatment are we adding to the room relative to the room's size? And then the thickness of the panel is going to determine how it does at bass frequencies. Thicker, all else being equal, is probably better. So that's a basic setup. You can see a diagram of the guy's room there, right? So you've got, you know, several panels up in the front of the room where the mix desk is, and then panels on the rear wall. Not a ton of space we're using in the room. But look how different it is. Go back and forth a couple times, Mike. Mid-range and treble, go ahead back, much more consistent, right? Way more consistent. And then look at the bass resonances, the upper bass stuff especially. Look how improved that is. Those resonances, the decay times are much shorter. Still not perfect, we have a long way to go. But even 45 hertz, look at that one. Even that got a little bit better. And that's just with, you know, 4-inch thick absorbers. So if we can use bigger devices, like the next one up from the 244 is the Monster Bass Trap. It's the exact same thing, but it's a 6-inch absorber inside instead of a 4. So it's going to do better at the bass. We'd get even better results if we were using those. And then we can use bigger products from there. So it always comes down to how much space we can use.
A lot of the people that reach out to me are starting out. You know, there's a bed in the room, it's small, it's cuboid, it's hard. It's hard to get that room to sound right, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be servicing that client. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be starting down the path towards getting them in a trustworthy relationship with their speakers. If you've got a couple $100, you're gonna get some 244s. If you've got several more $100, you're gonna get several more 244s. And I don't mean to make this so simple, but really investment levels in the short term, we just want to get some paint on the canvas. You know, we need to get some coverage in the room so that we can stop the bleeding. Very dramatic sounding, but it's also easily that simple. The 244 is the lowest cost per foot professional panel in our line. It does damage to the room's impact on your speaker's response. So Every room starts with 2-4-4s. We're gonna hit first reflection points with them. We're gonna hit corners with them. So I wanna put those 2-4-4s in your room, not only because they're the best tool to stop the bleeding, but they're the best tool to grow with, right? You're gonna start in that bedroom with a few 2-4-4s, and they're gonna do everything for you in that environment. Later down the road, they're gonna be just your first reflection panels, and you're not just gonna have one on the wall and one on the ceiling and one on that wall. You're gonna have 2 to 3 on that wall and 2 to 3 on that wall, 4 to 6 on the ceiling. And when you grow and when you do that and you grow the size of your first reflection strategy, what you're doing is you're allowing your head to move around more, because now that you're out of the bedroom, you've got more tools. I've got compressors over here that I gotta reach for, so I don't wanna be getting reflections when I do that. I'm gonna lean back and listen to the mix, so the first reflection strategy grows. Doing that with 2-4-4s is a very, very impactful way to get that job done.
Reflections we define as sound that bounces around the room like a billiard ball, right? You can track the trajectory of mids and highs above the Schroeder frequency based on what angle is that sound leaving. You know, some sources are very omnidirectional, some sources are very directional. Speakers, for example, quite directional. The mid and high frequencies, we get a dispersion. We understand, you know, how wide does that speaker project? How tall does that speaker project? And then once we know when it's headed towards a wall, we can kind of say, okay, well, it's going to go there. And once it goes there, we know it's going to go there because it behaves like light. Now, below the Schroeder frequency, Mike's going to kind of talk about how that kind of stuff behaves. It's a little bit different. Really, so I'm getting the easy job here, right? Because conceptually, this is a little more, it's a little easier to understand. You kind of see how a ball bounces off a wall and what directions it's going to go. If you understand billiards, you can kind of understand first reflections. The way we kind of look at this, or the way we've always kind of told people to look at this and think about it, is if I've got a frequency that hits my ears from my speaker, and then it's going to travel to the wall and then travel back. It's going to come back later in time, right? And James kind of pointed at this. Acoustics is a time-based problem. It shows up in the frequency response through phase cancellation, through comb filtering. The frequencies that are louder that we're perceiving in this frequency retard graph, it's a constructive, additive thing that happens between the direct and the reflected sound. Areas where there's less energy is a nulled frequency, where when that frequency arrives a little bit later, the point that they both are at in that waveform determines that that frequency is not going to be heard, right? So what does this do to you? I mean, you're sitting there and you're trying to make choices about a mix, and let's say you think the voice is too sibilant. Well, I'm going to turn down 3K, right? Because the voice is so sibilant. Well, if I've got a peak in my response at 3K, that's not on tape. It's not bedded into the track, right? It's something that you're perceiving because of this distortion in the way your room is messing with your speaker response. So what we want to do is we want to attenuate the reflection so that it doesn't arrive at the mix point and cause that problem. So, you know, you make this drastic move in the vocal track to get rid of 3K, go out to Dave's car with him, right? And listen to that track. And now the voice sounds like this. I've taken out all that sibilance because my speaker told me it was the thing to do. Now we've got to go back and correct, right? Because we thought we had a 3K problem based on what we heard, right? So we've got to fix that problem. And the way we do that is by treating first reflection points. So if we go to this next slide, it's going to be a very basic sort of idea. Again, that blue line looks like a billiard shot going from the left speaker to the left wall and hitting that very round head. And then the right speaker also has its reflection path that's going from that same left wall and hitting that same very round head. We know we want to hit these points, and you can use a mirror to find that points. If you're sitting in your room at your desk and your speakers, have somebody move a mirror along your wall, you see the speaker, that's the reflection point. Because again, these frequencies behave like light. So we're looking at light when we're doing that, right? So if I were to put a little patch of absorption on my left wall, just big enough for where that red line is going to hit, right? And I do that same thing where that blue line is going to hit, I could sit right here and everything would be perfect, right? But I can't do anything because it's just that one point. So if we go to the next slide, what we're looking at, and we don't even need the last slide because I'm just going to explain it here. What you're looking at here is your room on the left side, right? On the right side, I've made a mirror of that room, right? So I'm not looking in a mirror, I'm conceptually putting it in 2D, right? So instead of just worrying about where that tiny little head is, what we want to do is worry about where that larger circle is. And what that does is that gives me this freedom. You know, if I want to lean back and listen to my mix, if I want to lean forward and listen to my mix, if I've got to reach for a compressor and make sure it's not bypassed, you want to maintain that reflection-free relationship with your speakers for all the places in the room that's going to be viable for you. Now, if this is a home studio, that might be all you need to do on the right wall, right? Where this red cone and this blue cone are intersecting. But maybe you've got a client couch in back, right? So maybe we want to worry about the reflections for that person too, right? Maybe there's a producer's desk. You start drawing a lot more dots. You start drawing a lot more circles. You start needing to increase that reflection area. We've got a myriad of panels at GIK that can sort of help with this, absorption panels. And back to the idea that James brought up with sound having size, and those big, really distinct spikes in the low end, right? You could use a thin panel and affect the reflective relationship between you and that speaker. But if you do that, you're really sort of missing an opportunity to also work on those really defined low frequency spikes, right? Like Mike's going to talk about where bass traps go. How far do we want to take it, really? You know, that's going to be sort of the question. How far can we take it? There's going to be size restrictions. There's going to be budget restrictions. So, you know, it's very common to start with maybe a 2-3 inch thick panel. That's only going to affect that frequency spectrogram that we looked at earlier, 300 hertz. You know, it's not doing anything to the bass range. But if we make this first reflection panel a little bit thicker, you know, like James did with those 244s, that's how we start to see all this improvement in a frequency range. Like, think of it this way. We're putting that panel there because it's a first reflection point. But if we make it thicker, we're going to not just impact the reflection, we're going to also impact the low end holistically in the room. So anytime you have the opportunity, you want to do that. What's the best panel for this? The thickest one, right? In the studios here, they're incredibly thick, you know, and they're diffusion in some cases, and that's a very unique situation that you don't see really anywhere else in the room, in the world. And that room's 1-to-1. Typically, we're using very thick absorption, ideally. But what we want to do as an acoustic designer is sort of back up, look at the whole plan. What kind of investment do we have that we're going to make on this room, right? And if we think of the idea that, you know, I'm going to start this plan with 244s. They're a relatively low cost per foot panel. And I put a couple on the left wall, I put a right wall, ceiling, corners. You can grow with that, right? Because, you know, make the sweet spot bigger by later on down the road when you get a little more coin in your pocket. Take those 244s that used to be in your corner and make the sweet spot bigger, right? Add more coverage to the ceiling. Add more coverage to the sidewall. Give yourself more freedom. Like James's situation, which obviously was an incredible improvement with those panels, relatively cost affordable, and kind of the way that we're going to recommend that anyone starts their room. You're starting with a panel that's thick enough to be a toolkit in any kind of situation where you move that around and you know, upgrade the corners later. And Mike will talk a little bit more about that. But also, to this point, we've really only looked at stereo, you know, and oftentimes, particularly now, surround sound is more and more of a focus. So if we look at, you know, just say like a 7.1 system, right? The person would still be sat here, but I'm trying to clean this up and not show you everything in the mirrored reflection of this room, like the speakers aren't there, but this is where that person is sat, right? So now we're looking at all these different places where the trajectory of each of these speakers is going to impact that listening zone, right? So what's happening? Now, we used to just cover this. Now we need to cover this if we want to maintain frequency integrity for the surrounds, the rears, the center, all of that. But also you're noticing there's a lot of overlap, right? Like we don't need to dedicate, oh, this is my center channel panel, right? because that's kind of taken care of with the red and blue panel, right? So you're sort of doing this study of the room and how much reflection control you need. And it's worth pointing out that the more reflection control you need, the thicker those panels really should be. It's going to be something that Paul's going to sort of touch on with the balance of the room. If I'm on a budget and I start hitting all of these surround sound speaker reflection points with the very thin panels, you're going to very quickly run out of real estate for bass traps to keep up and keep that balance intact. So, right? So surround rooms specifically tend to need thicker panels because they're going to need so much more square foot of coverage to get that job done. It sort of needs to be thicker. Otherwise, you're going to end up with, Paul will talk more about this. First reflection points on front and rear walls, right? So a stereo room, you're not terribly concerned about the front wall because traditional studio monitors don't really send information towards the front wall. You capture all those reflections on the rear wall. They've been captured. They don't need to be trapped when they can't bounce to the front wall. But when you've got rear speakers, the front wall does become more reflectively problematic just because of the direction that those speakers are pointing in, right? So here again, we're just hammering home more coverage for more speakers.
My two favorite GIK products are the sound blocks and the soffit traps. In the most basic sense, it's because they're the thickest things we make. You put those in all your corners, including the ceiling wall, and you have solved so many bass problems just like that. Nothing, unfortunately, there's no magic to it. It's just the bigger a bass trap is, the better it works. The soffits are what we steer people to when they want high performance. The sound blocks are kind of the companion for something that's going to go on the wall. And because it's a modular system, it can be a full range panel. It can have a range limiter in it, so it's more of a bass trap. It can have a scatter plate on the front, so it's now also a diffuser. They have a rail system, so you don't even need to mount them on the wall if you want. So, when you have a challenging, say, a rear wall of a bedroom that's all of a closet, I can, do a whole row of these things, and now I've just gotten super high performance in an area where a closet would have made mounting anything impossible. We probably talk about bass trapping more than anything, and that's because it's the foundation. It is the hardest thing to fix. It's the most expensive thing to fix. It's the thing that takes up the most real estate to fix. In what we do, retail acoustics, it's harder than it is when you, as he described, like having these 4-foot rear walls, absorber, bass trap things. We don't have that luxury, but people are still hoping to get that kind of performance. So to us, we have, figured out ways that we can kind of give people a performance that is, as good as it can be. And arguably, in most cases, we can get incredibly good sounding rooms, very professional rooms with stuff that you can put in a box, which is cool. But ultimately, nothing is more important at all. Like John said, with the high frequency stuff, that stuff's pretty easy. With the very high stuff, you can put a towel on the wall and you have made a change. But that doesn't mean you're going to be able to mix in that room. You have to get the bass right to be able to mix in the room. It was kind of like what James said. We've all encountered that where you're mixing a song and like certain notes just jump out on a bass track. Those are the modes. That's the resonances. All rooms have disproportionately more energy in the bass than everything else. They all do. As they get bigger, the relationship gets much more balanced, which is why, studios like to have big rooms, especially, in tracking rooms, it's important because you can have a nice neutral space, still have some ambience, but like, as you guys have probably, if you've done anything in this room, you can put a mic in front of something and it kind of just sounds like that thing, if you're close enough. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the room has a nice even distribution of bass frequencies. But it goes beyond that. It also has to do with, he talked a little bit about modes. Modes are resonances, plain and simple. It's more complicated than that, really, but they are resonances. Below the Schroeder frequency, they are kind of the principal resonances related to the dimensions. So just because the math is easy, like at 10 feet, one of the primary modes, or the second mode, is going to be 113 hertz. Half that, 56.5 hertz, would be the first mode, like really the lowest mode that room will comfortably support. So if you think about that, you've got dimensions front to back, axial, and left to right, also axial. Then you have tangential, which is where it kind of bounces between four surfaces, and then oblique, where it hits all 6 surfaces. All of those things are modes. They're all resonances. But the axial modes, the ones that go between the front, back, left, right, top to bottom, those are the strongest because they get the most reinforcement from just bouncing back and forth. And that's the thing. A mode is really, you probably hear the term standing wave. You've probably all heard that. And a mode is a standing wave, is a resonance. They're all the same thing. It's just different ways of calling the same thing. And all it is like, for example, going back to that, 10-foot room, this 113 hertz, it just means that the wavelength is exactly the right size, that it just keeps hitting the wall and going back and forth, and it just keeps getting reinforced. The worst case would be like if you have a tube, it's going to have a very defined resonance. That's like the perfect description of a modal resonance, but it still happens in rooms to a less degree. Like when you hear flutter. Same concept. It's just 2 parallel walls of stuff bouncing back and forth. Well, when you get to the bass and you have that same problem, so much harder to solve because the wavelengths are so long. Energy is so great. So because these resonances are just, they're part of every room, now we get to the thing where small rooms, as I said here, small rooms have too few modes. Okay, so if we go to this is a 10 by 12 room. This is a Room EQ Wizard, which is great software, by the way. We might talk about that a bit later. But this is like, I have speakers set in the room with the listening position, and this shows me what modes are natural to the size of this room, right? Now notice, this is 47, 48 hertz. I've got, this is the red ones are the front to back, this 12-foot length. So I've only got 4 modes, right, below 200 hertz. With the green are the, this way, right? So we've only got 3 modes. Same thing, ceiling is the blue ones, so we've only got 2 modes vertically. But you notice how wide it is. So the problem with them being wide is exactly what I was talking about. Someone hits a note that corresponds with one of those modes, bang, it's off the charts. They go to the next note that's like, say, right in between these, has like much less energy, and you're trying to make a decision about a mix, and it keeps going, oh no, that bass is too loud. It's like, oh, I better fix that. And you get out to Dave's van, and it's like, oh yeah, where's the bass? Like that one note, it just keeps disappearing on me. What's going on? Well, that's the room fighting you. So in small rooms, we have this problem. Okay, so we go up to a slightly larger room, 15 by 19 by 9, actually a pretty good sized room. And you notice there are more modes, and there's more modes per octave. So now we're starting to get to the point where whatever note we're going to play, we're getting a little bit more support from the room, and it's going to be a lot more even. And then as you see, you get to a very large room, 19 by 24 by 10, a lot more modes, and they're spaced more tightly. So now we're covering more notes. So there's almost nothing that we could play that's going to fall so far outside one of these modes that it's not somehow more balanced with the rest of them. Maybe we get down here, below 40 hertz, there's going to be some holes, but that's pretty common. It takes giant control rooms like this to get around stuff like that. And again, because we have this disproportionate amount of bass in a room, we're fighting this, which is like skewing the whole thing. So the high frequencies are here, but the bass is just naturally like this. So bass traps are how we try to fight that. It's hard to do. As I said, it takes up a lot of real estate. They're generally expensive, although ours are not so bad. But there's a couple different ways of doing it. The most common and the most basic way to do it is what we call a velocity trap, or a porous absorber, which is basically just a big hunk of insulation. It could be foam, but foam generally doesn't have the size and the density and the volume to control the low frequencies the way we need to. So that is the most common type. They don't really have a frequency cutoff or a frequency range aside from the low frequency that they will absorb. So the thicker that absorber is, the lower the frequency it will absorb. Hence the 4-foot rear wall bass trap. It's like, we're trying to treat down as low as we possibly can, and we're going to devote, just loads and loads of absorption to get as far down. You know, when it comes to something that we can stuff in a box and send to you, there are limitations, obviously, but this, you know, this is like all of our favorite thing is this right here is the soffit trap. It's a 17-inch square. They're almost 4 feet tall. Those things will absorb down to 40 hertz. No matter what, we see data all the time of just how well it works. And as you get more of them, kind of getting back to James' thing about coverage area, as you get more of them, sometimes they go lower than that. You need a lot, but they go lower and lower. And again, the larger the better. That's why we love the soffits. They're big, you know, and when people are like, yeah, they're expensive, and it's like, well, it kind of depends. You know, there is the budget limitation, there's the space limitation. All of that is important, and we have other ways to deal with the bass that are maybe not as large and not as expensive. But ultimately, all we're trying to do, you know, the battle, so to speak, is that we just want to try and get your bass right, because when we get the bass right, the rest of the room is going to be really easy to mix in, you know, and that's ultimately all we want, you know. The tri-trap, which is a triangular one, extremely popular, you know, because they don't stick out from the corner as much. They're a little cheaper. Aesthetically, most people prefer them because they're not sticking out in the corner, but it's like taking a soffit trap and just slicing it right down, you know, the middle, right? So naturally, it's not going to reach as low. You know, it has a little bit less surface area. Beyond that, we can go down to panels like our monster traps or our 244s, which are just, you know, it's a 4-inch absorber, it's a 6-inch absorber that we mount, you know, straddle mount across a corner at a 45-degree angle. The thicker that is, it's no different. The thicker that is, the better it's going to work. You're leveraging a little bit of performance by the fact that there's an air gap behind the panel. An air gap can be kind of a multiplier of sorts in that, you know, if you take an absorber and you put it right on the wall, it's going to do one thing. You pull it a little bit away from the wall, it's going to work a little bit better because that's a velocity trap, meaning it works better when that absorption goes to the point where there's movement in the wave. When it hits the wall, there's no more movement in the wave. Pressure goes all the way up. Velocity is at 0, and then it turns around and goes back in the other direction. So if you pull it away a little bit, so now we've just used distance to get better performance out of something, and it cost us nothing, you know, aside from a little space in the room. But even that, and that's another forum thing, is that, you know, people always talk about, well, air gaps, this and that, and it's like, as with everything, especially in acoustics, there is a point where the air gap is like, you know, it's like, well, if the air gap is good, well, I mean, shouldn't we just like set them out here in the middle of the floor? You know, look at that giant air gap. Well, it doesn't work quite like that. You still have to be somewhere near where the energy is strongest, which is always going to be near the wall. People will say that, you know, putting stuff in the corner, we hear, you know, of course, we hear all kinds of things. Well, you know, that's really not the best place to put it. And it's like, well, it is. It's absolutely the best place to put it. It's the best place to start because all of that bass energy, you know, we always say we go into the corners, right? Well, that's because all the bass energy, which is bouncing back and forth between all these things, it's funneling to that common area, which is common to all of these surfaces. And so if I put a bass trap in that corner, I'm affecting this wall, stuff that's on the floor, stuff that's on the ceiling, especially if it goes all the way to the ceiling. That's like the most efficient way to do it. You know, when people are just getting started, we deal with their reflections and we deal with the corners. And it's a really great way to just get you started down the path because it's like such an immediate improvement. And it was pretty simple, you know? And, you know, again, it's a pretty simple device. You know, we try to make them look nice, you know, because you're going to put them in your room. But, you know, even if you're crude about it and you just go pile up a bunch of insulation in your corner, it's absolutely going to work. You know, it's kind of foolproof. Now, there's another type of bass trap called a pressure trap. Remember I talked about how, you know, we had velocity and then it hits the wall and it stops. Now we got pressure. Well, a pressure trap works on that energy when the pressure is up and the velocity is down. They're incredibly effective when implemented properly. Difficulty is that implementing properly just takes a little more knowledge and a little more testing and a little more specificity to use them right. You know, I have a situation with my room. You know, this is called the Scopus trap, which is our membrane trap. It's, you know, 23 inches square, 10 inches deep, and it's got a piece of mass-loaded vinyl inside of it with insulation behind it. We can calculate what frequency that is at based on the depth of the box, how much insulation is in it, and then most importantly, the mass of that membrane. So we can tune them anywhere from 100 hertz down to 40 hertz. I bought some that like were returned to the factory, and I just thought I wanted to try them in my room because I didn't have a whole lot of experience with velocity traps. You know, they're very hard to build and you got to get things right. Well, put them in the room where I knew all the bass energy was, you know, and it's like, yeah, this should be great. And I put them in and I measured it and there was like no change. It's like, okay, something's not right here. You know, now granted, I'm sitting in a living room and it opens up to a kitchen and there's a hallway. So it's not like I'm in a concrete box with very known specific dimensions. You know, windows, doors, all these things change. That modal distribution that I showed you, you know, it just kind of goes out the window once you add all these other elements. Because a modal plot, you know, like that, the one that I showed you, there's some online, and they're great because they give you an idea of what your modal frequencies will be, but you can't trust them 100% because of that. You know, you're not in a concrete bunker. You have openings. You know, there's all these variables that are going to change that. So here I am, you know, Mr. Genius Acoustics guy in my living room, putting them where I think they're supposed to go, and I get nothing. Decided to just do some experimentation, had my son sit at the desk, played some music. I was moving him around, and I like hit a spot, and he was just like, whoa, 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 stop right there. And it's like, okay. And it was remarkable what it did because I did have a bit of a decay problem around 45 hertz. And it was just, it tightened the bass up in such a way that I, you know, could not do with any other treatment. But it ended up in a place that was like, well, I would never expect your average consumer to find this. That's kind of the caveat with those, is that they're really fantastic at doing a very specific thing if you have the time and the ability to measure and maybe, you know, interact with someone who knows what they're doing, who can kind of talk you through it. It's not always automatic. And I only say this because, you know, again, it's a forum thing. I guess it's being preemptive that you're always going to see people on forums like, no, you should only use pressure traps for the bass. It's the only way to get the bass right, completely discounting the fact that, you know, we use soffit traps in rooms all over the world and they work amazingly well. And people say, no, porous absorption doesn't work. You got to have pressure traps. Well, you got to have pressure traps if you know where to put them and you've done testing and you know exactly where they're supposed to go. This kind of goes back to the thing about modes. It's like, where do bass traps work best? Well, axial, absolutely. And what these are, this is from one of those online modal calculators, and it just shows you, you know, axial mode. Like I said, that's between two surfaces, right? When it says 1, 0, 0, and don't worry about remembering this because it's not important, but all that means is that's the first mode from the front to back, in this case, front to back dimension. That red and blue, that just shows, yeah, this is where the pressure is highest, this is where the energy is the highest. So that's a good place for a bass trap, you know? Same thing, tangential, which is, like I said, it's more like a diagonal thing. If you think about it, kind of hitting that wall, and instead of traveling straight, it's kind of going across the room. You got to think about what's happening. It's not hitting like here and then funneling to the corner. It's actually starting somewhere near the corner, or it's hitting somewhere near the corner. So now you think about your bass traps in the corner. Well, maybe if we made those a little larger, you know, maybe we're going to get some of this tangential stuff too. Now, it's lower in energy than the axial stuff. Axial stuff is the big stuff you want to take care of first. But once you get that under control and you're like, well, it could be better. Well, yeah, this is what we're doing. We're going to make these corner trapping devices larger and larger because we're just trying to, you know, get all of it down to a reasonable level to where, again, we can just listen to the music and react. Modes, you can do it. It's very simple math where you just take the dimension and you divide it. You know, like if it's 10 feet, you know, there's going to be a 10-foot wavelength. That's your axial mode, number one. There's going to be a 5, you know, that's your second one. Then you can go, you know, thirds. So it's 3.3. And then, you know, you can go quarters. That's going to be about, you know, 2.5 feet. All of these. And you can prove this to yourself by just playing tones through a speaker in your room and just walk. And you'll hear one. Oh, there goes another one. Oh, there goes another one. Every few feet, if it's pink noise, you know, you'll hear all of them. But you can like say, I mean, just as an experiment, you could like measure out one length, calculate what the frequency is. I'll just divide it by, you know, if it's in feet, just divide 1130 by the dimension. It's going to tell you what that mode should be. And then play that frequency and then just walk from front to back and you will hear peak, null, all those things. It's so obvious. And then maybe start walking left to right. You're going to hear, again, you're going to hear changes. You're going to hear changes. It's just, so all of those changes, all of these places that we can put bass traps, the more of those that we do, the less those changes are so audible to us. The sound is not going to be the same everywhere in your room. It's just not possible, you know, until you have the real estate to devote to it. So when we get into smaller rooms, our main goal is that we just want it to sound good at the mix position, because that's where all the decisions are made. If you have clients on the, you know, the rear sitting on the couch, well, then that would be next, because most likely while you're working, those people are back there judging you the whole time, you know, and going, geez, the bass is out of control back here, because they're sitting where all the bass is, you know, it's all speakers point at the back wall. So that's kind of a really important thing. And that's another reason in giant control rooms why there's so much trapping on the rear wall, because there's almost always a client couch back there. And you do have to make it pleasant for them, because they are literally reacting to the work you're doing there. It's really important. Nonetheless, the idea is that the more of these problems that we solve with bass trapping, the better the room keeps getting. And getting back to the thing about the spectrogram and frequency response, people will look at the frequency response and maybe they add new treatment and they're like, yeah, the frequency response didn't really change much. That's where we're like, let's look at the spectrogram, let's look at the waterfall, let's look at time, because there's always a change. It's just as you get closer and closer to this like full treatment, the changes start to become pretty small, but audibly, they're pretty dramatic. You all know, mixing is hard. It's especially hard when you just can't hear it. That's why people go to headphones and stuff like that. But it's a different thing. When you can get your room to the point that you don't have to check your work somewhere else, that's how it's supposed to be. You know, I haven't checked anything in my car in 10 years because I have a good room. Ultimately, you just want to be able to sit there, listen, react, make your decision, and move on to the next thing. So it ends up kind of saving you time and money. You know, that's the good part, right? How much bass trapping is required to achieve what I was talking about? Well, as I'm quoting Paul, all of it. Like, you just, how much can you fit? There's no such thing as too much. People will say, oh, I don't know, man, I think they overtrap the room. It's like, no, it's literally not, it's not possible. People will put their speakers in the room and they'll, you know, set them a couple feet away from the wall, because that's what the speaker manufacturer said to do. And they go, man, I don't have any bass in here. I think we have too many bass traps. And it's like, why don't you push your speakers like really close to the wall? Oh, well, the manufacturer said, that's cool. Just push them close to the wall and move your desk forward a little bit and call me back. And they're like, oh, yeah, the bass is like right there. It sounds really cool. It's like, there's always some other problem. It's never because you have too much bass trapping, period. So, you know, of course, speaker position, listening position, all of that stuff is super important, and it's not easy, especially in small rooms where you kind of got one spot that's going to be relatively balanced. It's rare, but we get rooms from people that sometimes you just have to say, man, this is just, it's never going to be good. You know, I mean, you have to be honest, because I don't want to just sell someone a bunch of panels and then they're still in a bad room, and now they have less money and they still have a bad room. So I'm not really doing anybody a favor there. But for the most part, we can take, you know, your typical 10 by 10, you know, cube basically, and turn it into an environment you can work in. Is it perfect? Of course not. But is it better than it was? Yes, by a big margin. And it all comes down to bass trapping, you know? And again, getting back to the time thing, more bass trapping makes bass tighter and clearer, which in effect makes the rest of the system clearer and cleaner. So many times people have to make EQ decisions based on, maybe it's a clarity thing, which has nothing to do with the clarity. It's just because the bass is stepping all over everything. And if you can knock that stuff down and get it all nice into balance, then all of a sudden, you know, sometimes you find yourself, or I find, working in a good room, you usually find yourself doing half as much stuff as you do in a bad room, because you're constantly fighting what you're hearing, and you think the solution is this compressor, this EQ, automation, whatever. The better that environment is, the faster you work and the easier it is to, you know, to make a decision, shall we say. And a lot of people, you know, they want to jump to their pressure traps, and they want to jump to their diffusers, because those are exciting, sexy things they've read on the forums and everyone says you're supposed to have in a studio. And we're like, yeah, you know, a diffuser would be cool, but I mean, you're never going to hear it until we get the bass under control. And nobody really wants to hear that, because they really want the cool diffuser on the back wall. our responsibility as designers is to not let them do that until they've got a room that's good enough to reveal that.
So thicker panels are necessary if we want to be absorbing not only high and mid frequencies, but also some of the lower frequencies as well. You just can't really absorb low frequencies that have incredibly large wavelengths with thin treatment. If you can, it's much easier, and often you're killing multiple birds with one stone if you can use very thick porous absorbers. So then you're going to have a lot more room balance. It's going to end up not a dead room, but a dry room. You're going to end up with a dry room across the different frequency bands. So that's the reason why we'd always recommend to use the thickest panels that you can, and as many of them as you can as well. We're kind of gathering by now that if you want to mix, a room is a problem. You can say I have a great room, but it's still a room. It's only so great. In an ideal world, we would just take our speakers and put them outside and mix out there. When speakers are designed, they're tested in anechoic chambers, which kind of emulates a space where there's no boundaries, a little bit like a field. Or if you were elevated in the air by 100 feet and there was nothing around you, that's how you're going to get a true response of a speaker. And so they spend hours and weeks and months trying to develop these speakers that have a really flat response. And then we go and buy them, we put them in a room, and it sounds completely different. In an ideal world, a control room or a mix room wouldn't have a tone. There wouldn't be a tone. It would be a neutral space. The only problem with that is, and we get this a lot, people get scared that if they're going to put a lot of panels everywhere, they're going to end up with saying this to us: I don't want the room to be too dead. What can we do about that? Well, really, a dead room is a strange term, because it only really happens if you haven't taken care of the bass, which Mike kind of hit on. I think we're all kind of telling you need to control the bass. That's the most important thing. If you have a room and you just put up a load of 1-inch pyramid foam and you just cover all of the surfaces, all the first reflections, they're in the high and mids, maybe the higher side of the mids are going to be dealt with pretty efficiently. But the only problem with that, it's kind of like turning the bass control up on your hi-fi. Now you have an overemphasized bass, and you have even more of a muddy, boxy room than you did to begin with. And if you're using foam, then it might catch on fire as well. What you need to do, we know that we need thick panels that are absorbent from the highs all the way down to the lows. And we need a lot of coverage, because the wavelengths are so massive that you need a lot of panels. There's no point just having like the bass trap in the corner and expecting that to absorb all of the bass. The only problem is, you have all these thick panels everywhere. You've killed the room, but it doesn't sound dead. It sounds even. It sounds balanced. Apart from, that's only as far as the sound from the speakers is concerned. So the speaker to listener response sounds great when you're listening in that room, and you basically have no more boundaries, and you've taken care of the low end. What you're hearing is now much more like the anechoic chamber that the speakers were designed in. And that's really the only way you're going to get a very accurate representation of what you're mixing. We want to basically make the room disappear, acoustically speaking, which we've done with all of these very thick panels. And the speaker response sounds more like how it was designed in the first place. But we're human. We tend not to really like spending time in rooms where our brains can't really locate where the boundaries are. It kind of makes us feel a little bit uneasy. it kind of makes us feel like we're in a padded cell or something like that. You know, maybe it's going to drive us insane. And other people have, depending on your tolerance to this, some people can stay in a room like that for hours and hours and think that is fine, and they can work there. And I'm kind of more like one of those people. I don't really mind so much if the room is very well controlled, with zero reflections. Other people, they can't really spend long hours of time working in these rooms without any kind of reflective elements in the room. So what we need to do is we need to start introducing some reflective elements that scatter the sound and also provide some localization cues. This is where it gets into psychoacoustics. So you're in the room, and now all of a sudden you're looking at a wall, and the wall in front of you, but you're also hearing some kind of feedback from your movements, from your voice when you're speaking to clients. Maybe you want to pick up an acoustic guitar and start writing something in the mix room and then overdub something. It's a much more comfortable environment to be in, but we don't want to undo all of the hard work that we've done already by putting all these absorbent panels everywhere. If we do too much, we're just going to end up back right where we were, and we're just going to have reflections everywhere again. So how do we do it? Well, location is something that we can do. So you'll see some examples here of in the front we have pure absorbers. The front of the room has just pure absorbers on the sidewalls, on the ceiling. And then towards the back, we have these kind of cool looking panels. So these are the GIK, modeled by John, the GIK Alpha panel, Alpha Pro Series panel, and the Impression Pro Series panel. Now they have these reflective scatter plates on the front. You'll see these kind of notches and dots and things that are cut into them. So what that does is they're still primarily absorbers, actually, even though they have these reflective surfaces on the front of them, but they're cut in a way that majority of the mid and low frequencies is just going to go straight through into the absorbent material behind, but the scatter plates on the front is just enough to provide some high frequency reflection, which is where the clarity is, so that the room starts to sound a little bit more natural again. You know, the best places for these types of panels, in my opinion, I mean, there's many ways to do this, but particularly in small rooms, you want to just mainly have those towards the back of the room, so that you still have your reflection-free zone around the mixing area. So the sidewalls, the sound hitting the sidewalls forwards of your ears is still absorbed, but then if you turn around and you start speaking, you're now interacting more with these kinds of panels that's going to reflect back some of your movements and your voice when you're speaking. There are other ways to do it as well. If you have a larger room, maybe you might want to start looking into some diffusers, such as the GIK Gotham, or the Grid Fuser, or the Q7D. I don't know if you can see it. Oh, there's a picture there. There's also these curved devices here, which are the polyfusers. They work slightly differently from these panels. Some of them still do absorb, but less so. They're more diffusers in the traditional sense that the sound is going to be reflected, but not in a specular manner. It's going to scramble the reflections in a way that the energy is kept in the room, but you're not going to be able to, it's not like a very strong reflection coming back that's going to be distracting. So it's all about just balancing the frequency response in the room and getting the decays under control, but also, because we're human, we want to feel comfortable when we're working in these rooms for long periods of time. In a live room, it's less critical because you can move a microphone around, you can move an instrument, you can move it closer to a reflective surface or closer to an absorber. In a control room or mixing room, you have one spot and the speakers don't move. It has to sound right in that location. That's why putting different types of panels in the room in certain locations is so critical, because you don't want really to have any influence from the room while you're mixing. The room isn't doing us any favors.
For product development, you don't need to just understand acoustics. You need to be able to understand the people and the market and what you're selling it to and what people need these products for. And it's getting all of these elements together and being able to develop it into a new product. I mean, the excitement that I think everybody in GIK still gets when you see you go through a magazine and you see a photograph of somebody and they're stood in front of one of your panels, and you know that some of these #1 top 100 Billboard hits are being played, have been recorded in the studio with your products. There's just a little bit of you've created a product, you've been part of building the product, you've been part of the team selling the product and advising on it, that then actually turns into a record that millions of people around the world are listening to. There's that part, and I think that none of us have ever lost that passion. Most of us are still either got recording studios, still playing our instruments, and it's that side of things that I think that has always set GIK Acoustics differently. Physics exists in all circumstances. What these guys have been talking about today, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make physics work for us instead of physics working against us. Because we know physics exists, we know there's going to be nulls and peaks, we know small rooms can't be perfect. What they can do is they can be better. Part of my role within the company is I look at where is there a need for different products. What do we do, and how do we do that as a company? How do we go around and say, what do we need next? And a lot of that is because we talk to people. The guys here, they're talking to people all the time. And even now, we say, oh yeah, we know 99% of the problems. It's always that 1%. There's the fun bit, because you always get something like Mike was describing. He went through it and it took 2 days to work out his position. Surely he could work it out by now. But physics doesn't work like that. And what we've done here, this is the classic. The classic, it's the egg carton. I mean, I'm hoping these days, we're all a bit better now and we haven't done this. I've talked to, university lecturers over years and people say, yeah, I have actually done it. And technically there is texture, like we were saying, would work. The reason that this come about as a kind of a myth now is a couple of reasons. The main reason is to do with foam companies. And I think it probably was Orlex themselves who first came up with the concept. And the reason is somebody in the R&D development was trying to do, how do we make that real estate that we've been talking about? How do we get more out of it? And with a pyramid on a foam, what they're doing is increasing the absorption area. It's really, they're not using any more space on the wall. And that's how research and development works. I would never recommend the egg cartons for the pure fact is they've got a purpose and they're for eggs. And they do a tremendous job of that. And also, you have to eat a hell of a lot of eggs. It gets boring after a while. There's other things as well. We can look at it and we hear a lot about soundproofing and how that works. And I've seen products, and there used to be a really well-known video. And it was a drummer in the desert, and they'd put him on a pallet, so they detached him away from the world, and he's drumming away. And this company comes along and they say, our panel will stop sound. And to prove it, what they do is they lower a box over the drummer. And suddenly you can no longer hear the drummer. I mean, I've always maintained on this, and the theory is because you don't see him at the end of the video, clearly the reason you no longer hear the drummer is because he's dead. Because if you put an airtight box on top of anybody, I mean, you've got as long as the size of the box before you're going to die. And the concept is any of those materials that's airtight would stop sound, because we know how sound travels. It travels through the air and it travels through vibrations, but we also know in their video that they'd moved in from those vibrations. So therefore, but it doesn't mean the panel works, no. So at GIK, what we're doing all the time is we're always looking, and this is just a selection. In my office, we joke about it, and I'm on Zoom, and every time there's a Zoom meeting, there's another panel behind me, there's something else. I'm always like this, coming across, going, look at this, look at this. We've got hundreds of them, and all the time we're looking at new ideas and how we fit. And one of the things you're going to look at is creativity, because you can never lose the fact of what we're doing here. It isn't all about, whether we're going to, which button we're going to tweak, how we're going to do this sound. This is about creativity. creativity. One thing I never lose fact of, I'm still the most proud I can ever be. When I'm listening to things now in the church and it's still, they've used my panels. Maybe I designed them. Maybe Mike here designed their room, and still I'm so proud to think that just part of that creativity, part of that thing that all those millions of people are enjoying, we've been part of. And that's, so one of the things when you look at design is you want an environment that you actually feel creative in. You've got to sit there day after day after day. You know, you don't want it to be that sort of dead room. It's got to be something exciting. And these, again, this is just more of the sort of things that we're doing all the time to try and have a look at your needs and what it is that you can do for the future. So really, we just want to, at this point, thank you everyone for listening to the team. You know, the idea of doing free acoustic advice is we really do want, you know, you start on your journey, you understand those rooms, and you can take it everywhere with you. So thank you very much. I mean, one of the things that we've always been clear about when we employ people is we want to employ people who understand the customer. So people like James and John and Paul, Mike and Melissa in the US team, and we've also got a European team of Lucas, Eugenio and Paul again. One of the advantages we've had in recent times is I've been able to get together with the acoustic advice team, and we've done some forums, we've sat around and we've had a look and said, where can we make these products better for the future for our customers? This is what our customers want. This is the type of things that our customers don't like. What can you do that's, you know, not, you know, to make these products better? How can we help? You know, what advice and help and support do you need for us to achieve that? And once we got the team together, the ideas for the future, the amount of different things we've done has just been amazing. But it's all the people around. It's such a collaborative issue, and that's what I'm just sitting here now thinking. There's no one that isn't involved in some. Even if I come back in and I've got this idea and we've done it, and me and Sergey, my UK plant manager, will be looking at it, and I'll be calling in somebody from the customer service team, and I just go, what do you think? You know, what do you think of this? And it doesn't matter even sometimes just acoustically, you know, what's your gut feeling with this project, and you walk in, how do you feel about it? What do you think? And I think that's, you know, that's the important fundamentals to acoustics. I mean, I know that you can click onto all the acoustic advisors are going to tell you their journeys and the excitement they get with helping you. And I get the same excitement knowing that I'm filling their toolbox to do that job.